Hello and welcome to English for Wednesday, September 30th. Is our agenda there? We are considering the Monacan Indians today in our mini bridge unit of Coexistence in Native America, Day 3. So we're going to consider today a bigger conflict. We're going to start using a poem by Karen Wood, a local Monacan Indian. She has her PhD from UVA in anthropology and studies the Monacan Indian, her people. She just passed away last year. So here's her poem, Chief Totopoto Mai, 1654. This is to say we continued, as though continuing changed us, as though continuing brought happiness, as we had known. On a dry field without cover, his skin blistered raw in the sun. Not one among us came, as though he had no relations. What did we say to our brother? How could we leave him alone, while soldiers guarded his corpse, as though precious to them? One of the women in darkness crept to the field where he died, prayed for him, covered him up, dust over what was not dust. We would have ventured out with her if we had loved ourselves less. We had to think of our children, and he was not coming back. How could we live with the silence, live with our grief and our shame? Death did not heal what he suffered. He was making demands. We did not want to be there asking the question he asked us, changing the sound of his name. He had embarrassed us. This is the memory we carried, avoiding the thought that he remained face down among the charred grasses, holding the earth with his hands. So we're considering conflict. And in this poem, you have the conflict of death. In 1654, by then, the Powhatan Confederacy was already disintegrating, and this chief in that Powhatan Confederacy would have been a victim of that conflict. It's frequently painted as a conflict of arms, like a war between the colonists and the Indians that they arrived to find. A lot of the time, the conflict was simply death. Many Indians died. Most, in fact, died of disease that beat the colonists. So one case of smallpox would have been enough to wipe out an entire Indian village, leave it a ghost town, so that when the colonists arrived, they found nothing, something that they could conquer, but in fact, something that had been filled with people before. So in a way, the meetings of peoples in the New World was not as important as the meetings of their germs. But all of that is to say that the death of Indians in this nation is something that we want to look at today. And maybe that's death, actual death, like in the poem. Maybe it's paper genocide, as our article will talk about, the way that the federal government didn't recognize a tribe as a tribe. And then there's, of course, the war. Here's our poet, Karen Wood, the Monacan Indian, that we read. It's important to keep in mind, though, that the Indians were not only victims, that they also had their own ambitions and own goals and their own lives to live. And here's a slide just going into understand number 4 again, before we consider the conquest, or the ways that ethnocentrism resulted in violence. I'm choosing this metaphor of the land for this image here. On the right, you have a British garden neatly laid out in rows, fences. On the left, you have a Native American garden. And when the British arrived, they didn't even recognize this on the left as a garden, where the corn would grow with the squash and beans, because they're used to the images where everything is laid out in their eyes neatly. The fences would keep in their cattle and sheep, but the Indians had no cattle and sheep. There was no need for fences. So the Virginia Company were amazed. They grew everything together. The Indians did, squash, corn, beans. The British were not used to seeing the way that they let the land grow fallow with all of the edibles on the ground, things like dandelion greens and sassafras. They didn't recognize those things as edible, so what they saw was wild, unused land. And they pitied the Indians for this. Meanwhile, they themselves couldn't figure out how to grow much and catch any fish, but they still thought of the land as something worth taking or settling. That's why we try to use the word colonists instead of settlers. settlers implies the land was not settled, and it was. But the colonists would carve their space into the disintegrating political factions of the Powhatan Confederacy and others in this eastern part of the country. This reminds me of the first day of class where we looked at the Native American burning practices of the forest and forest management, and how the federal government refused to allow the Indian tribes to burn the land because they saw fire as only an evil, without realizing that fire is medicine, in the words of the article that we read. So it's the same metaphor of the land representing something different to two different groups of people, and the conflict that comes from that, making it seem more palatable for one group to simply take the land and regulate it. As Karen Wood puts it, Virginia Indians kind of fade from the history books around 1700 once we're no longer a threat. And then Indians are cast as obstacles to civilization throughout the country. As the colonists move west on their land, the Indians are chased off because they're in the way. So the rest of class, we read this article. And I'm going to pull it up, but explain a little bit about how we did it. I spent a brief amount of time going through the structure of a news article just to help people digest this relatively long piece. I used to teach journalism at Monticello before they needed me to teach 11th. And there's some features of journalistic structure here that we're going to see replicated in the piece. And they're features of good pieces in general. You're going to see this if you start paying attention to news articles. They're going to use this structure in some ways to guide the writing. It'll start with a lead or a hook, then a nut graph, which is like everything you need in a little tiny piece of writing, and a nutshell, as it were. The money quote, which is going to be the best quote of the piece. Context and background, which takes up the majority of the piece we're about to read today. Questions being answered, the activism of the piece, what is to be done with all of this information. The tick-tock is timing, what happens next. And the kicker quote is the second best quote of the piece. So this article, if you click on it, is going to show you my annotated version. I'd like you to read this one for your asynchronous work today, because I don't need you to read all 17 pages. You do need to authorize Google Drive in order to access it, and you should be able to do that with your school account. And then on the right, you'll see in the margins 10 steps. And I want you to go through those 10 steps to read this piece. You'll see them in blue. So number 1, for example, is read the headline and captions, then read the lead, then read, I'll tell you exactly what to read, this short graph and this quote. And then when we get into background and context, I'll have you read a couple of pages at a time. So it just makes it a little bit more manageable while still capturing the major features of the piece that I want you to understand and walk away with. And then your STEM for today is here. So, thank you very much. Have a great night.